Hi, Simon. Thank you so much for being here with us at Next Big Idea. And we are going to have our conversation about what can we do to make Europe a more startup-friendly space. And you are one of the fathers of our recent commitment on that. So let's begin with that. First of all, we are going to take our masks off.
Yes. I was tested this morning, but yes, we should all wear masks all the time.
When we think about innovation and of the names that we are more used to listen, like Google, Apple, Facebook, and all of the others, Amazon, Tesla, they are all from America. So we almost can say that if it is not, but if it was a contest for popularity, United States are winning by far. And one of the things that people that are more aware of these themes in what concerns public policies, one of the themes is it wise to compete in the same terms with the Americans? Because we are just admitting that for being successful, we have to have the same kind of success that companies that were born in a different context with different rules are now in our mindset as icons of startup success. Do you think it's true that maybe we should think in other terms when we think about European startups?
That's a big one. First of all, I think it's definitely worth noting that China is on a very similar trajectory as the United States is, and it's probably even catching up and being ahead already. It's even more different, but if we talk about policies, it's driven by policies. So it's a very strategic approach to digitize the industry. And I think ultimately it's inevitable for Europe to catch up. What I tend to look at in terms of our history is the comparisons to other phases of economic development and significant impact on innovation. Obviously, the industrialization age is what's closest and what we can look at. And if you see the impact of that and how long it took for that impact to manifest, then we're at the very, very beginning of this. And look at AI, right? AI is a technology that we broadly, vastly understand what the real impact could be and will be. And it's too easy for the Europeans to say, hey, maybe we need a different benchmark because we're different. Ultimately, Henry Ford invented on how to create industrialized cars, but there's others that got to be a lot better at it than the Americans. And so I think it's a question of timing, and it's ultimately also a question of dedication and the right policies in place. And so, yeah, I think we need to use the same benchmarks, and I definitely think we need to catch up.
In this commitment that was launched in March, the Startup Nation Standard, one of the things that was discussed was if having in 2030 double number of unicorns that we have by now in Europe was a good metric comparing to, again, United States, because in that year probably we will, if we reach this goal, it would be the same that saying that in 10 years' time we will have in Europe as many unicorns as United States by now.
Yeah.
So we would still be behind.
Yeah.
Why did you choose this metric, and how do you comment on this delay that we would still have if this is our goal by now?
First, important to say is that the Startup Nation Standard was crowdsourced, and I contributed. It's not all from within my scope there, and there's challenges with some of the formulations, which is probably. That's one of the advantages and disadvantages of Europe. It's always about compromise, right? And so is the Startup Nation Standard. I was pushing on some parts. We were pushing for much tougher suggestions and examples. But back to the unicorns, I think what we have to understand about this whole technology and economy play is it is growing exponentially, and it is with every cycle of new chips, things double in speed, and they're not going incrementally, but actually exponentially. And I think if that is true, then naturally by 2030 we will have double the unicorns. So you're right about that. That's not going to get us anywhere. And I think what we have to solve for is the X. We have to understand what is this sort of growth dynamicism looking like for others, and what does that mean for us? And you need to look at 10 years, and you need to probably look at 20 years and 50 years and understand what the individual implications are. If you look at education, for an example, I'm of a generation, I wanted to study on how to do entrepreneurship and interface design, and that simply wasn't available because it was all too young and too fresh and too new. This was in 1996. And this is, of course, has dramatically changed. And even now, the pandemic has created such a turbo for this whole space, both education, but as well economy to some degree. But in education, you now are able to do a Harvard class, which is certified, and you're doing it from Bangladesh. That's possible. So I think we are constantly underestimating the impact and the potential that technology has. And I think this is also true for our wider economy. When you compare what startups are doing and how valuations like €1 billion for a unicorn, $1 billion for a unicorn come about, then there is a metric assigned to that is in relation to its possible growth, right? And the difference between the established industry and startup industry is always looking back at these differences in potential. You can go public in the United States without being profitable and burning millions. I mean, how is that even remotely possible in our standard understanding of economy? But that's where all of the parameters we're looking at are changing. And it's so much of a changing environment that designing policies is so incredibly different. Policies ultimately need to be as agile as the technological advancements are. And, as politicians are sometimes not even understanding the status quo of technology. That's not a confrontational statement. That's just a reality of it, right? I work with many politicians, and many of them are older than me, and not all of them are digital natives, to say it softly. So if I take all that into the equation, I think we're not aggressive enough. We're not looking far enough ahead. And we're not thinking enough about how to create thousands of startups that ultimately end up in tens of unicorns. We're not even looking at the 9 companies out of the 10 that fail. We only always look at the one that succeeds and try to help them the most. And I think really the play is, how can we get as many people as possible to try, start a company and possibly fail, but ultimately create more unicorns. And that would be my solution to it. Start companies by the dozens, left and right, for everyone.
I'm going to ask Europe for explaining to some of the people that are watching this interview, one of the things that is not very well understood is why those companies that are losing lots of money are so incredibly desirable,
Yeah.
And that have small business, but profitable business. They don't feel that they are as desirable as that. So how can we explain this in the simple terms?
Yeah, first of all, I would disagree. I think all companies are equally desirable, and the established industry growing slowly is still as relevant for job creation, not as fast, but as relevant for the stabilization of our wider economy. Yes, some of these companies grow so exponentially fast that the valuation that they have and the way that people look at their value is not in relationship to how they make their money or how much money they make, but to the potential that they could have in making money. I'm giving one example. Amazon, as an example. Amazon started off as selling books online. And Amazon decided to invest in other verticals than just books. So they started to take over e-commerce, actively competing with the eBays, actively competing with some of the other businesses that existed back in the 90s and early 2000. And at some point, they had what it's called a defendable market position. So they were so powerful and they were so big that they were able to, in part, dictate terms, which is a debatable thing. It's debatable whether this is good or bad, but they were surely able to turn on profitability by changing some of the ways that they work and reduce the amount of money they invest into growth. And that's a magic formula. Imagine you're building a company that is based on software, so you're actually growing without, or you can grow without investing into production or into materials. You're growing by hiring people to write more software, but your potential is that much higher because the cost of what you need to invest into distributing your software is very little. So as a Tesla or as a Mercedes-Benz, you actually have to produce thousands of cars, and that costs, and it has an enormous cost and an enormous complexity attached to it. writing source code for a software is, to some people, very, very abstract and difficult, but it's actually nowhere nearly as resource intense as building a car. And that's why I believe the valuation always is in correspondence to the potential and not necessarily to the profit, and definitely not in relation to the resources required in order to make it happen.
Now let's really talk about Startup Nation standards and all the beginning. How did it start?
It's a different journey for many people involved. So what's important to know about the Startup Nation standard is that it was crowdsourced. So there was a lot of contributors. And I've been working with the European Commission since, I believe, 2013 or 2012, when in Factory Berlin we realized that when putting a lot of amazing companies together, you don't really need to help the companies because they're amazing, they're helping each other, they're working with each other. It's a vortex of innovation, if you want. But we had a lot of surrounding parameters that didn't really understand startups and entrepreneurship and are in need of moderation. The European Commission has a definition of what's called the triple helix. It's the established industry, academia, and policymakers. And now if you add startups to that mix, which are these, move fast, break things, terrible, wearing hoodies, and not eating pizza all day, and not caring much about what they touch and who they touch and how, you realize that there's a lot of moderation necessary, and that really, ultimately, the framework for success is designed by politics. And that's hopefully never going to go away. That's one of the values we've created in democracy over the last several hundred years, yeah? And now if I look back at the time in 2013, 2014, what I realized is without working with the European Commission, there's really no point in thinking scale, because ultimately startups are only working if they have a scalable market, a product, of course, but in a market that they can reach and address. And I immediately realized that Europe is a terrible proposition for any startup trying to scale. VAT, hiring in different countries, having different systems of law, corporate law, having different ways of forming a company. It's all not very harmonized. And so I started interacting with the European Commission, and being a founder and not really having the agenda, being a startup entrepreneur myself, and not really having the agenda of a big corporate or a company or a political party, I was able to relay the message, hey, you need to wake up here, because there's something awfully wrong with how we tackle and how we handle our biggest potential in the economy compared to the United States and China again, right? That's the elephant in the room. Everybody wants to catch up to the US and China, and that's not easy. And so the European Commission was interestingly very open to all these suggestions, but by nature, they cannot suggest law for the member states to just implement. They can suggest it, but it needs to go through the parliaments to actually take place. And after years of lobbying, we had conferences organized by myself and my team at the time with commissioners, venture capitalists, unicorn founders, all in one room discussing what needs to change, and ultimately nothing changing. The Commission themselves came up with the idea to say, hey, why don't we turn this around, and why don't we say, if you want to call yourself a startup nation, you actually have to abide by these 8 standards. And I thought, wow, that's a phenomenal idea, because you're turning it around. You're not making it a mechanism of law and abiding to, it's not top down. It's like, you want to be a startup nation? All right, this is what you have to do.
What are the things that most European founders agree? And what are the things that mostly divide them?
One thing almost everyone agrees on is the employee stock option problem. This is interesting because just to explain this very briefly, in a startup, and this is complex matters, sorry if I sound technical, but I'll try and make it as simple as possible. If in a startup you're getting a share of the company, let's say you get 1% of the company, and you just get this as an option. Only if you stay with the company for a longer time, you get actually that % of the company. In many countries, at the time you get that option, you already have to tax this as income, right? Now imagine the company grows by 1,000%, which is not unheard of. Then your 1% suddenly is worth so much more money, but you don't even own it yet because it's still an option, but you have to pay taxes on the capital gains. So this is prohibitive. Right? It's prohibitive, but this is the main and important thing. it is one of the most relevant mechanisms to distribute wealth that is being created in startups to the wider economy. And the result was that in Europe, employee stock options, which is one of the key mechanisms that distributed wealth in Silicon Valley, so Elon Musk as an example, many of the things he has done have originated from his work at PayPal. Probably he was a regular shareholder, never had stock options. I don't know the details, but it's the mechanism in which much of what has been created abroad is sort of incentivized and distributed as wealth into the economy. Now, in Europe, we are not, VCs, venture capitalists are always saying, hey, your employee stock option program is too small, but employees don't want it because they don't have the money to pay the taxes. So it's really a catch-22. It's where the cat bites the tail, because what we really want is for many people that gain the experience of working in the startups to be in the position to then again found or later found their own company and create a startup because they know so much about it now. And that mechanism was almost prohibitive due to taxation, and that was something everybody agreed on.
Now that we have this declaration and this commitment, how would you define your own main goal?
For those 8 standards to not be relevant anymore in 5 years from now, because everybody adopted them. No, I mean, really, the thing that I've always been an advocate of, fought for, sounds like military, and I'm not in the military, so let's say I'm an advocate for it. I think Europe has something incredibly amazing to offer. And if I look at the challenges I've seen in the last years in the United States, if I look at some of the mechanisms at play in China, I'm very much in disagreement with that. And if I look at Europe, I think the biggest opportunity we have is that even though we are culturally diversified, we still have a unified understanding of our moral values and of our social values. And ultimately, I hope that is possible to transcend into global business, because right now, capitalism, global business is not acting according to these values. And seeing how often companies fail, not just because of timing, but also because of challenging surrounding environments, which could be positively impacted by policies. That's just something that is so visible, visually obvious to me, that with policies we could deregulate the founding of a company so easily and without any impact on the wider economy. That's not a bad thing for anyone. The money that goes into startups is taxed wealth. That's not coming out of a bank as a loan, that doesn't create liabilities. It's other people's money that they made somewhere in order to help someone else build a business. For that to be under the same rules and frameworks as the wider industry makes no sense, and wanting to catch up to the United States, wanting to catch up to China, that's what we need to tackle in my book. And I think the Startup Nation Standard is the first step in that direction. Now we need to adopt, change, modify it, be agile about it, like I said earlier, in order to make that impactful.
Okay, so now a little step by step, I will ask you to walk me through this declaration and the main issues that are listed, those that you would like to see solved in 5 years. And the first one, starting a company in 1 day. This is one of the benchmarks that we have in Portugal because we do it for a decade. Why does it make a difference?
Well, the first thing that I would like to say is the price point of it is as much important, for 100 euros, as important as the actual time it takes to found it. Because the idea there is make it easier for people to found a company, right? And Portugal proved that to be relevant, I think. And there's an emphasis on this program to do it in 1 hour, which is fantastic. I think the thing to know there is what many of us were actually pushing for, is to do the same thing for closing a company, because that's much, much, much harder, right? The many don't do it, that's why it just keeps existing, and they're in the statistics, and it's not good for anyone. So closing a company is much, much harder. But if you look at the base democratization of startups, so what's happening through technology is that people can start a company that don't necessarily have to go to the education that you would used to go through 20 years ago in order to get a bank loan. And this is, of course, an opportunity to create simply more volume. And if in certain environments founding a company takes a week and costs you several thousand euros, then this is, of course, prohibitive. And what we ultimately want to achieve is that as many people also from circumstances that are not very wealthy or well equipped with money can found a company and can try to succeed with a business idea of theirs. And I think this is one step in the first direction, but it's nowhere near where I would like to take it. Closing a company is far, far more difficult.
attracting talent to work in European startups, namely outside European Union, but also for some people that are outside Europe and could come back to work in European countries. We have startup visa and tech visa. So what was our learning, from your learning also from Portugal with the startup visa and tech visa? What are the results and what can we expect from this goal for the next 5 years in Europe?
One of the key constraints in growing that fast, as we see in some tech companies, is to actually have the right people to work with you. It's one of the key constraints. I also think that every company that is now really modern, looking forward and growing very quickly, ultimately has a very diversified corporate culture, because everybody that can program somehow does it in English, and it doesn't matter where they're from. Some of the first and best examples I had with corporate culture were startups that had an active policy to have as many women working for them as men. And this was already in the late 90s, early 2000s, right? Because that's part of the DNA of what startups like to do and want to do. One of the learnings here is how difficult it actually is to do all the checks and balances in order to make that really swift and fast. So if you look at the procedure and going through SEV through CEF and making sure sort of that we have a legitimate person we're talking to, there's no fraud involved, and to not have to necessarily go to an embassy in order to do this, but to possibly do this online. You know, there's several pitfalls that we've encountered that are prohibitive for volume, so we can't do a lot of it very fast. And I think that European-wide, if you look at how easy now sometimes it is to open a bank account, and if you look at our current undertaking, which is to create an e-residency for Portugal, which also will have to function with a video conference call and not by going to an embassy, because otherwise it simply will never reach scale. You need to take the first steps. And in some countries, it's absolutely prohibitive to try and get somebody to work for you abroad. Here, we've developed these programs and they're being taken up. I think we're nowhere nearly as fast and good in volume as we could be, because it's very attractive to work in Portugal, part of the European Union, obviously. And the opportunity there is to first harmonize and have more experience in countries, and to find a unified system for Europe that works best. Because also we're making the differentiation here in Portugal between the tech visa and the startup visa. So one is for founders that want to come here and found a company. Another one is for companies that want to hire someone from abroad, right? Those are two very different, distinctly different things. Both are very interesting because they're targeting a completely different target audience, but it's all a visa, right? And this attracting talent is still a very broad definition of that. And I think we're going to see a lot of different mechanisms on how people and how countries, member states, make that possible. And this is essentially what this is. It's a broad field test. Like, everybody has a visa program. Let's all learn from each other what's the best way, and ultimately come to the best conclusion to have as many talented people come to Europe as possible.
Do you think that the pandemic will improve the way people look at this thing?
It's so tough to say, and it's horrible to see the pictures, people dying, the emergency rooms packed. There's so much terrible about the pandemic. I am the glass is always full kind of guy, half glass is always half full kind of guy. And for me, there's enormous opportunity, but obviously also there's an enormous challenge. We need to be very careful that we don't let technology just roll over our society, because there's a lot of danger. I don't know if you've heard of the Screen New Deal. It's an article written by a very, very good writer, Naomi Klein, who's very careful on how we use digital identity, how we use now the vaccination passport, you know, all those things where technologies seem to create an enormous ease of use in the beginning. If they're there to stay, then they create a trail which is really, really difficult to get away again, or to sort of keep our democratic values in synchronization with. And so I think there's a challenge there, but there's also an enormous opportunity. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, everybody said it's absolutely impossible to teach children from home. I'm sorry, that's proven wrong. That is absolutely possible now. Do we need it all the time? Should it be the only way? No, definitely not. Is work from home the best way to work? No, also not. There's a hybrid model that's required. But now we've all experienced the other side of it, so we're able to actually find the hybrid model. So I think it's a good and a bad thing, but for technology and for people in startups, there's definitely a lot of opportunity.
Innovation in regulation. This is a dearest theme in Europe, because if someone is making money, let's regulate it. So it's almost a mantra here, you know, it's something that Americans like to make fun of us. Yeah. How do you look at this, and why did you say, I read in an interview that you quote Denmark and Germany as good examples, and I would like to understand, what are you seeing in this?
If I look at certain technologies, for instance, financial technologies, right? It is not advisable to deregulate that across the board, right?
Does not go well.
It's not going to go well. No,
Yes.
We all know this. But it still is relevant to understand what are the levers that can be pushed, and with an existing regulation that is prohibitive for innovation, which you could argue, for instance, in the credit line of business, it's pretty prohibitive. You could say in banking it's rather prohibitive. But if you were able to single out a group or an area or a certain legal realm in which this is free to try and test without negative impact by opening the floodgates, but really by understanding, it's very similar to an experiment in a laboratory. Then you'll be able to identify innovation, and you can try to find out on how that is positively compatible to the existing frameworks. And that's ultimately what that is. And I mean, it's passed the Portuguese parliament. It's called the Zonas Livres Tecnológicas. We have it. We now need to use it. And I think one of the key aspects for success there is to work with not just startups, but also with the established companies. Because if you, for instance, the people that I've worked with at Google in policy, ultimately there's touch points with everybody in tech, and of course also with the big tech guys, Google and Facebook and such. They have thought a lot about on how regulation is negatively impacting the innovation space. Not just necessarily for the company itself, but also for startups and how they grow. Google, Facebook, they all actively invest in startup companies, not just for the acquisition, but also to understand where technology is heading, right? And with that in mind, I think we can design experiments, free zones in technology, which make it possible for us to understand better without having the risk of deregulating too quickly, or creating companies, like there's a few examples that are rattling the cage so much that we create social tension. If you look at some of the social tension we've had created both from social media, but also from Uber with drivers, there's been a lot of also negative touch points with our society. Cab drivers, right, revolting against what Uber is doing. Yeah, I wrote an article back then saying, hey, ask your nephew to write an app for you and then distribute it between the cab drivers, because, it's a technological thing and the technology is not that hard, it's there. But possibly we should have tried that out as an experiment first and understood where is it touching our established mechanisms, where is it in conflict and in contrast to our existing regulation, to then actively deregulate.
If we think about GDPR, yeah. Many media companies in Europe believe that GDPR was a big favor that the European Commission made to the big tech.
The big tech,
because we are not competing in a fair field,
They have the resources to handle it, whereas the small guys don't. Ultimately, what has been done a lot for big tech is try to put it into a framework, right? And Mrs. Vestager is very, very vocal about it, the Commissioner for Competition. She's very vocal about putting big tech into a rule set. But what often happens is that big tech is so resourceful that they're actually capable of working with those rules. Whereas a startup, when you look as a venture capitalist or as a business angel into a startup and they tell you, I'm going to revolutionize media, and you ask them, so how much of your resources is going into handling GDPR? And they don't have an answer, they're not going to get the money. And so we're creating, by regulating technology, we're often creating pitfalls, bear traps, for the small, fast, and early failing or fastly succeeding startups that are pushing the envelope. And that's what we need to prevent. That should not happen. And that's also where China and the United States are so far ahead of us. Many of the times they're just not regulating it and they just let it happen, and then when it happens they regulate after. But in Europe we often tend to have that course set a little bit too tight.
Hiring R&D in Europe, it's also the main issues in this declaration. And I would like to know if it is more difficult to hire R&D or to hire good managers that understand R&D. Because at least for Portugal, many studies say that we have lack of management, and you do have qualified people, you do have technology, but many times you don't have people that are leading the business that understands that is important.
I have a general, not issue, but awkward feeling when it comes to R&D and our understanding of it currently. Because to me, essentially, startups are a sort of sheltered R&D paid not by a big company, and then maybe bought by a big company, or maybe it becomes a big company, but we're doing economic experiments in the real world instead of in a laboratory at the moment. That's how I see startups. And that's also why research and development in universities sometimes is a completely different bubble to that of startups and entrepreneurship. And the first comment I'd like to make is that this bridge needs to be built, because that's the real problem in many of the fantastic products that exist in science, or that exist in R&D, never make it onto the real economy world, because it stays in the R&D realm. There's a few examples that do that. Okay, Hasso-Plattner Institute in Germany, Fraunhofer in Germany. I think the Porto Engineering School is really making a strong effort by bringing in the industry as early as possible into their curriculum. Stanford obviously is the most prominent example, right, where incentivization of the professors to spin off companies has led to some of the biggest tech companies we have today. So I would argue the managers, do they really need to understand R&D? No, I think they need to be incentivized to actually spend that money on R&D, because then it becomes a game where the resources you have, the money you have, decide over how much volume you create in innovation. And I think managers like entrepreneurs also are not very well fit to sit in a laboratory and design. I always say you need three people for a startup. You need an exhibitionist that wants to stand on stage and yell and scream and tell everybody what they want. You need a designer that is sort of thinking about how to approach, make it look and feel, and you need a programmer. If you have these three people, you're probably very likely to be able to create an initial product that has success. But if I look at the managers, that's more of the sort of on the extrovert side of things that need to be on stage yelling about their amazing success. And don't let them work with researchers, please. Just have them incentivized to spend the money on the researchers, have the researchers be in a lab, and then meet a great and an amazing entrepreneur and maybe a great designer, and together spin off and create a new company.
About access to funding, what has to change in order to be more effective?
Well, the first thing is, I think, why is it so low execution rate? It's because it's terribly difficult. I mean, if I look at some of the paperwork required and the way that it has to, if you compare venture capital to some of those public grants as two different kinds of tools with different origin, then venture capital can be like, all right, commitment, 1 billion, here's the lawyers, we're going to do it. And then, the lawyers ink it up, and the founders maybe, hopefully they read the documents, but maybe some of them haven't. I'm not sure whether Mr. Neumann from WeWork ever really read all the documents that he signed. But on the other end, you have this overly complex, triple vetted, so many different contributors and advisors, securing the transaction, a bank guaranteeing, and all these things, and a business plan for 10 years that needs to undergo the scrutiny of a professional business. All of that is rather complicated and possibly unnecessary, because we need to, I think, understand that the way that the speed of some of this innovation takes place also requires the same speed, and I said this before, in regulation, but also in financing and frameworking. So if I were to look at, and I think this is really important, you need to look at the different stages of the development of a company. If I look at angel stage, the very beginning, and where you sort of like three people trying to start something, doesn't matter whether it's a coffee shop or a technology business, all of this is a startup, yeah? At that point in time, you need access to simple, easy money. There's no point in trying to overburden you with debt. There's no point in trying to overburden you with bureaucracy. It needs to be as simple as possible, because we want to deregulate the early stage. We want to have as many people trying as possible. If you go on to later stages, if you look at the seed stage, for example, where you have a product, you're trying a product in the market, but you don't like really know yet whether this is the right thing you're going to do. It might change. You haven't really found traction, so there's not really yet a lot of success around the product, but you're still working on it and you found some money. That's a great moment for, and this is where Portugal Ventures is also very active, that's a great moment to distribute low threshold money. So, you know, being able to tap 100,000 euros, 250,000 euros, but with some substance, but not being perfect yet. Venture capital is actually rather lazy. Venture capital is when you have success. It's when you know that your product works. It's when you know that by injecting more money, there'll be a better outcome. But really, in the early stages, angel stage and seed stage, that's where the real challenges are and the real risk is also. And that's where the public hand needs to play a role, because the private sector is sometimes too reluctant to burn its fingers in that environment. That's why you call the angels usually triple F, the friends, the fools, and the family, right? Now, with the triple F angel stage, venture capital, private hand a little bit later in seed stage, boosting the economy. When it comes to venture investing, the public hand should be nowhere near and not involved. You can only invest over investment professionals, because ultimately you're competing with the most professional investors in the world. And you're always competing globally. There's no such thing as a national venture capital fund. They all look into the other countries and they all look at what's going on in Europe, because that growth stage requires for the business to be internationally active, especially from Portugal, but also usually from Germany and from other places. Now, in that stage, we have 200M, right, which I'm happy to be on the investment committee, and which was also sort of partially created from inside Startup Portugal, where the goal was, how can we attract foreign venture capital to invest in Portuguese companies, but how can we do it in a way that it's not the public hand that does it and does it all, because ultimately that could lead to a distortion in the market. If you have a lot of money going into companies that are not benchmarked by international professionals, but are benchmarked by, you know, the public hand, by administrators, or by people that work from government, the tendency can be that you favor the wrong thing because you lack the experience. And that's where 200M was designed in a way very similar to the Israeli counterpart, Yozma, in a way that it's a match-up fund, so only 50% of the money is coming from the state, but the venture capitalists, and possibly also the founders, depending on the structure, can buy back the shares that the public hand has acquired. And this is an interesting principle, because it gives you the possibility to have your cash investment as a foreign investor, but to be in there all the way and buy it out again when it is successful. So you're having you're halving the cash investment, and you're halving the risk. And that's a smart mechanism. And we've seen a lot of dump money being spent all over Europe. Public hand often considered to be dump money.
Inclusion and diversity, these are things that everyone is talking about in the civilized world. And you included these two in this declaration as something that makes, or something that's important to configure a startup nation standard. Why it was so important to have this when we are talking by side with money and regulation and hiring, and this is different, this is about values, and how Europe can make a difference if it embraces these values.
I think the main motivator for me to want to see that there was following the elections in the United States. If I look back at the last year, and a little bit longer even than that, I think not adhering to a common set of values, specifically in social media, has created a monster. And my personal understanding of Europe is that we share this understanding of sort of the relevance of the equal footing of our society in no matter where you come from, no matter what religion, and no matter what sexual orientation you have. And for me, the startup industry has always been on the forefront of this. It was very surprising for me to watch the last few years, because before that, you know, some of the companies were the first ones to come out with diversity. Part of the gender diversity discussion actually originated in some of these companies, right? And because some of the culture was terrible. Uber was again referenced for terrible bro culture, which ultimately resulted in Travis Kalanick leaving and a lot of it changing inside Uber, which is a good thing. So one of the dangers, I think, in startups is that it's always about money and good news. But really it isn't. It is also about the impact of technology on society and how we moderate that. And I think that if you look at the European challenges, yes, a lot of it has to do with scale, speed, money. But it shouldn't only be about the sort of the factors that make it more successful. It should also be about the factors that make that success more sustainable. And the sustainability or the social compatibility of this success will only be given if we have these moral values at heart. And ultimately, I hope that we can hold big tech also responsible to exactly this declaration.
About digital first, this is also it's one of the issues, and it's more or less obvious that it had to be here because, well, we have for the years ahead a big commitment in digital transformation. It's one of the main things about European and world recovery after the pandemic. The question that I would like to ask you is, if it is so obvious, and if startups are by definition the forefront of all the technological challenging, why did you felt that was necessary to include this as an issue?
The standard itself is mainly targeted not at startups, but for startups. So what we're trying, or what was the Commission was trying to do, and what we understood is worth helping in achieving, is for governments and for the policymakers to take some of these very obvious points. Employee stock options are also totally obvious. You know, not everybody knows about it, but it's absolutely obvious. A few years ago, mobile first was a stigma or a proclamation that everybody understands, yeah, of course, we're all going to look at our things from a mobile perspective now. The Estonian e-residency was never conceived as mobile first. It's actually on a PC, it's on a big screen. And so now in Portugal, we're doing it mobile first. And I think these sort of simple but obvious statements need to be repeated often and often and often, because there's so much catching up to do. If I look at some of the administrations, if I look at how in some parts of the world in Europe, paperwork is so incredibly important and almost impossible to surpass. I once invested in an Italian startup. I invested 10,000 euros, and I had to apostille, so send to embassies and back, original proofs of declarations and whatnot. And I had a file of this size on my table for investing 10,000 euros in a just starting company.
So, but that digital first in that sense is more for, again, politicians
Yes.
than for startups.
Yes, because ultimately what we need is for the administrations to think digital first. That's where it lies, that's where the magic can be in catching up.
Okay, and now our elephant in the room, that's, well, about taxes. Because
Yes.
it's not easy to be a startup and to start paying from day zero, even if we are only
And it's useless.
expecting to earn some money 3 years later.
Yeah,
How do we solve that?
It's useless. It's very difficult to solve. I've been running against mountains when addressing this. I had an encounter with a German minister, both on stock options, but also on deregulating for early stage, because the urban myth is 9 out of 10 companies fail, right? So why is our corporate law designed for success? So as soon as you found a company, and great, we're trying to do that in a day now, and we're trying to do it for less than 100 euros, but if it takes a week and costs you several thousand euros, and then you're not successful because your idea didn't work, and then you can't close it, and it's going to take you 2 years to close, why would you start in the first place? And so for me, again, it is about volume, it is about plausible approaches, because the approach of wanting to form a company and investing all this money was plausible some 50 years ago. But our corporate law was designed before the digital age. So rethinking that and thinking, okay, if it is true that 9 out of 10 companies fail, let's not look at the one that succeeds, because that's going to become a company, fine. What's up with the 9? They have to pay taxes, they have to file for VAT. Sometimes in Germany, this was a huge issue. You would get money from a venture capital investor, or for anyone, friends, fools, and family, the triple F. You would invest 100,000 euros and you spend it on invoices with VAT. Then you would go to your tax authorities and say, I would like to have the VAT back because I didn't get any VAT, so it's reimbursable. And then you would have scrutiny for 6 months because they would wonder, where's the money coming from? Why didn't you have any earnings? How did you get to the money if you didn't have any earnings? So all of these problems are essentially prohibitive for early stage. And early stage is, as we know, where the biggest amount of failures happens and where the biggest amount of volume could positively take place. So let's say if we bring the 9 out of 10 down to 8 out of 10, or 9 out of 10 to 6 out of 10, we would have double or 5 times the unicorns correspondingly already in Europe. So for me, this precise topic on taxation, deregulation, early stage, failure, making a company sort of be an experiment, but within a regulatory framework. You can't just hire and fire, you need to have some rules. But until it has revenue or a certain size or a certain age, it should just be an experiment.
No taxation.
Of course not.
A smaller elephant, but still an elephant. It's about communication and marketing for startups in a different Europe, because we still spoke several languages. In spite, English is our common language, but every country has its own culture, its own media, its own way of communicating with this closer target. But if we are hiring talent all over the world, if we are hiring money all over the world, so we have to be able to have an intention to communicate with everyone, no matter where he or she is. So how do we tackle this in what concerns communication strategy for startups?
Yeah, I think that has so many aspects to it, right? One is the outgoing aspect, so how you communicate your product. Which I think playing with local different color is actually a creative exercise. I think this is great. I think that's what needs to be done. And you know, there's the famous trouble of, I think, Mitsubishi or Toyota launching a car that had a terrible connotation in another country. So this is not a new problem, right? The acceleration and the availability of media and being able to reach Poland from Portugal right now with a mouse click, of course, changes that, which I believe leads to more of a common understanding of marketing and design. I'm giving you one example. In Germany, we used to, or we still call our mobile phone handy, H-A-N-D-I-Y, right? Which is a word that does not exist in English. It just sounds really good. And it sounds really good to most of the Germans because it sounds English. So you had a lot of sort of English marketing references that transcend into local culture. And I think that trend is going to continue. Ultimately, the computer is written in English. But so that's the outgoing side of things. And if you look inside the companies, I think we also have to understand that English is your base tool. One of the key concerns that I see is that most of the venture capitalists are actually acting globally or acting internationally, and the common base language of business in that realm is English. So if you're a founder, if you're the CEO of a company, like I said before, you need to be an extrovert in the first place, so you need to be liking the stage, you need to like to stand up there and speak, but you also need to really deliver the emotions, and you need to be able to sell your product. And that mostly takes place in English. So my advice is English is unavoidable when it comes to that specific segment of the economy. It doesn't mean it should sort of replace local culture. It doesn't mean it should replace the cultural diversity that we have, by no means. But it needs to play with it. It needs to be sort of incorporated that you need it and you'll have to use it, but you need to be aware that you're losing something if that's all you do. So it's a bit of a conundrum.
Okay, the famous last 3 questions.
All right.
And short ones. Well, you founded Factory in 2011. It was a game changer for what I know in Berlin startup scene. And 10 years later, what would you change if you were now the founder of a place like that?
I had internal quarrels that I would be now wise enough not to have because I'm a little bit older. But other than that, I wouldn't change a thing. I think the interesting thing that we did was we focused on the best companies that we liked and put them all into a cluster. And I believe this is a formula that is now, widely adopted. It happens in many places, not for nothing, again, also in Lisbon and Criativo do Beato, where I'm lucky enough to build a factory in Lisbon. And I think it's a blueprint, actually, to make entrepreneurship more tangible, which is the most interesting part. Usually, startups tech is something virtual. You can't see it. It's in the computer. Nobody really knows what Uber does. It's or Google. It's all very difficult. But when you can walk into the office of a founder, like back then, Alexander Leung with SoundCloud, who launched an iPhone app just yesterday to 180 million people downloading it and playing music from it. And it's a normal guy. It's a very intelligent, smart gentleman, but he's approachable. You can talk to him. He'll explain to you how it happened. That's inspiring. And I think that's the biggest part of the formula, and that helps politicians to understand better, that helps the established industry to understand better, and it creates a lot of synergies with the wider society. And I think that's an important role. So that I would continue to do, but I would be wiser at dealing with my peers.
In 2019, in an interview, you said that you felt happy and honored to be in Portugal. But Startup Portugal that you are leading would be a temporary mission, as it should be in this kind of missions. But my question is, and what's next?
Oof, I wish.
Is it too early to ask what's next?
It's not too early to ask. It's too early to ask what's next in sort of specific terms, because I don't know. I feel very welcomed by the government, by Portugal, by my ability to, help design policies and help build bridges in Europe, which last month with the Digital Day had a pretty strong peak, right? That was a big moment for me because I worked for a very long time on this. So I have no intentions of going anywhere at the moment. I think at the time there was a lot of talk about building factories in other places, but that doesn't sort of replace me wanting to be here and wanting to be in Portugal. And, it's a challenging position because ultimately there is a new phase also now happening with the recovery and resilience funding. There's a lot of sort of tension on digital transformation and the wider society. I see a lot of insolvencies about to happen in the gastronomy space and in the hospitality industry. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be tackled hands-on and really sort of be designed very, very well. And for crisis times, I'm not sure whether I'm the best fit for it, but if I'm allowed to stay, I will stay.
And now, to finish with about yourself through your own description at LinkedIn. So you are an entrepreneur, an angel, a startup and tech policy activist in Europe, and a passionate driver.
Yeah.
I think that we already know all the other stuff. Entrepreneur, angel, policy, so passionate driver?
Yeah, I have a car problem.
You have a car problem?
Yeah, I have a car problem.
Tell me about your car problem.
I should go to Car Drivers Anonymous. No, I love driving. To me, driving is a bit like meditation. And in Germany, very famous, the Autobahn, all that. And yeah, I'm lucky enough to sometimes be able to go to Estoril and drive there. And it's a real big passion of mine. But it's not just the driving; it's also the mending and the screwing and bolting. So I actually also work on my cars, and I fix them. I try to fix them. I'm not always able to. It's something that's a very difficult job. But yeah, I love cars, I love design, and I love driving.
So it's your meditation.
Yeah, it's what
alternative.
It's what I need to do in order to settle my mind. Yeah.
Very well. Thank you, Simon. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.